Today we have an update. We start the update by pointing out that the legendary, the Firelath legendary, has been buffed, in particular in AoE. Now the Rage of Firelath stacks go all the way up to 50 instead of 5, which means you can now hold this for big AoE situations and have a much larger burst of damage in AoE. This is your run-of-the-mill Ret Paladin doing a 27 basically very recently after the hotfix, and this is the damage of the newly buffed Rage of Firelath doing over 16,000 of your DPS and being one of your higher sources of damage in a Mythic Plus key. Now, what is the question for today? The question is that a while ago we had this video right here. So we were wondering what was going to happen to these two-handed wielding specs the moment they got their hands on this legendary. This was over a month ago. This was a couple of weeks into the season when, presumably, of course, not many, if any, players had a legendary. So we were wondering how the damage was going to look. Are these specs doing poorly now because they are being designed and balanced by Blizzard with the power increase of the legendary in mind? Or is the legendary not going to change much in terms of the performance of these specs? Also recently, we have gotten some complaints from the player base, straight up from the beacon of knowledgeable takes, which was Reddit, complaining that all of the specs that can use this legendary are doing terribly right now. They are basically all at the bottom. Even more funnily enough, some of the more meta specs this season, like Havoc, and even all of the rogue specs are melee specs, not using the legendary. And yet all of the ones that do use this legendary are not doing nearly as well. Now, before we go and judge these specs, let's point out that we literally just had a video trying to warn players not to put too much emphasis on the all bosses damage rankings. Even worse, all bosses damage rankings on a 95 percentile result that is even less reliable. So this is definitely not comprehensive of the performance of these specs going all towards the bottom. If you go and look at our example of single target dummy boss in this raid, which is Volcaros, there you go. On a single target dummy, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the legendary wielding specs, so every single one of the DPS specs in the top 10. So in the top 10, you have 5 out of 5 of the legendary specs when it comes to single target. Obviously, it's not consistent on all bosses. If you switch to Igira, you only have 1. The others are in the bottom half. If you go up to something like Larodar with some extra AoE, you only have 1 in the top half. The rest are still in the bottom. If you switch to Nimue, you have 1 and 2 in the top half, the others are still doing poorly. In Smolderon, which is another single target boss, you have a few more towards the top half, 1, 2, 3, and 4 doing better. Even though, of course, some of these specs, in particular the outlier being Frost, are doing poorly, it's still not as terrible as we see here. These specs are not doing nearly as badly as this overall rankings would suggest. Now, the question though still remains, were these specs balanced with the two-handed legendary in mind? And then the next question is, if they were balanced with the two-handed legendary in mind, why are some of these still doing so badly? Is the situation really that hopeless for Frost DK that they are one of the weakest DPS specs while having a legendary? You know, how much more weaker would they have been if they didn't even get their hands on a legendary? Since we talked about the specs doing better in single target, like a fight like Volcaros, you can still see the progression on the damage improvements over time with, for example, the 2 DK specs starting in the bottom half of the damage, and then throughout the tier, they went both of them up by quite a lot. You can see the same treatment for a spec like Ret, which was in the middle of the pack, which went further up over time. So you can see the improvement over the tier in terms of their performance thanks to the legendary. However, overall the performance is still quite poor. Also, right now we are talking about the raid. If we switch over to Mythic Plus, we have had this situation already, with Ret and Fury being the 2 good performers in Mythic Plus, and then Unholy Frost and Arms being the poor performers. Even if you look at this over time, you can see Red Paladin right now being quite high up in the top 5-ish in this last week, right? The one that just ended, the fortified week that ended. If we go at the start of the season, so we're talking about basically no legendary for anyone. If you go at the start of the season, you can still find Red over here. And you can still find Fury in the top half. If you go back to current time, Red is still here and Fury is still here. Same goes for the bottom. At the bottom, at the start of the season, you still had the 2 DK Specs right over there. So it's not that their legendary has changed much of anything in their performance. The major one changing was Arms, really, who at the beginning of the season, it was more of a 50-50 split on who was playing Arms and who was playing Fury. But now, over a month and a half after, the amount of Fury players have significantly outnumbered the amount of Arms players. But in terms of performances, there hasn't really been a major turnover, a major surprise once one of these specs got their hands on this legendary. So at this point, there is the question for today, after we have gotten at the very least a good idea of what this legendary did for these specs. Point number 1. Is it okay to have a legendary weapon that isn't really doing that much in terms of power? We have already seen this as an example in Season 2 with the Evoker legendary. The Evoker legendary was a minor damage increase, it was a minor healing increase, it was mostly used because of the high item level of the weapon and the effect being a nice one, but it wasn't something massive in terms of legendary effects. This season though, the new legendary was a shiny, pure DPS effect just for sheer damage. And the effect doesn't seem to have changed much in terms of the performance of the specs. So you have these two sides of the argument. I would rather want to have my spec not balanced around a legendary, so I can be strong by myself whether I get the legendary or not. So I can't demand this legendary to be OP because I want to be strong already without legendary. Or the other side, which was what we assumed when we made the video about this legendary. Okay, I will live with not being very strong for a month and a half, however long it's gonna take me to get this weapon, but once I get it, I want to see the actual powerful effect of the weapon rising up my rankings, rising up my power level significantly, now that I have this legendary. And at the moment, at the very least, we seem to be in the first example. We seem to be at a place where turns out the legendary is not really affecting too much the power level of the specs. And at that point, it begs the question, why are these specs all so weak? Maybe it's just casual. Maybe it's just a coincidence. It's not that Blizzard went overboard with not buffing these specs because they were expecting them to become much stronger with the legendary weapon. Maybe it just so happens to be that, like all the times, Mage becomes OP, Rogue becomes OP, Warlock becomes OP, Augmentation remains OP, and these two-handed weapon specs are just left by the side. Maybe it had nothing to do with the legendary. Then you have the other question though about this legendary, because this one is quite pricey. This one takes some time to farm and to grind, but also some gold to be able to obtain this legendary, even more so, way more so than the legendary for the Evoker last patch. And also the acquisition rate of this legendary, even though it won't spam the chat every 30 seconds reminding you that an Evoker is getting this legendary, the acquisition rate is still quite slow and quite RNG heavy. So you have a legendary that doesn't really give you that much power to transform your C tier or D tier meta status into an A tier status being brought in Mythic Plus or being brought in a raid slot. On top of that, it is kind of hard to obtain, and on top of that, even after you have obtained it, not even giving you that much more damage, you have to spend some 3 to 4 to 500,000 gold to even get this weapon online. That is why, once you take all of these things into account, The release of this legendary has been a little bit of a disappointment. One, you had the specs grabbing this legendary being weak. Number two, after having the legendary, they have not been rising particularly in their power level in both the Raid and Mythic Plus. 3, on top of all of this, the legendary was so weak on release that it had to be buffed like 3 times over to even make it a reasonable damage effect. And then you have 4, the acquisition method is still quite scarce and RNG heavy, and 5, it also costs still quite a bit and significantly more than our last Evoker legendary in this expansion. So once you take all of these things and you try to gauge the experience and the value of this weapon, it is a little bit disappointing overall. We might have been in a completely different situation, complaining about Blizzard balancing these specs too softly because once they got the legendary, they all became flavor of the month OP picks, but that didn't happen, not even close so far. So that's the take for this season's legendary. I'm not even that particularly triggered myself, as I don't play any of the specs having to deal with this weapon, so I'm not even angry about my own specs in this case. I barely even play with specs that can use this legendary in the first place, so this is more like a neutral, a bystander take on the effects of this weapon. So I'm going to leave down room for you in the comments, especially for the ones who have gotten already their hands on this weapon, to say, to give their 2 cents on what the experience about this weapon has been so far with their specs using this legendary weapon. What was their expectation in terms of, growing, in terms of damage, growing perhaps in terms of popularity or in terms of meta level once they got their hands on this weapon, compared to the harsh reality of the situation right now in the meta in both Mythic Plus and the Raid, which sees these two-handed weapon wielders not really having that big of an improvement in their situation even after using this legendary. This is our point for today on this Thursday, I believe. As mentioned, I'm going to leave your takes down in the comments as we leave each other once more for today. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters, of course, for the contribution and the help, but also for everyone who can do it for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as, of course, subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with all of these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, personally, I would be mad if I had to struggle that much on a shit spec to spend hundreds of thousands on a legendary and then I wouldn't even be meta. That would be annoying.